Welcome to Domain 2 in the CISA exam prep series, and in this session we'll focus on IT governance, the backbone of an effective audit process. In this section we'll elevate our view to better understand how leadership, structured frameworks, and strategic direction shape everything that happens in IT. We'll unpack core governance concepts and the vital distinction between governance and management, and how an integrated approach to risk, compliance, and data classification builds trust in technology-driven organizations that are so common today. Mastering these principles will not only prepare you for critical exam questions, but also give you the insight to recognize what effective governance looks like in practice. Let's dig in. Welcome back to the CISA exam prep series, and here in Domain 2 we're focused on governance and management of IT, in Part A on governance in particular. And while you may know me from my exam prep content here on YouTube, in my 9 to 5 I'm a cybersecurity strategist and a vCISO for a regional bank where I'm exercising my cybersecurity knowledge every day, like that which you'll find here on the CISA exam. More importantly, last year I helped thousands achieve cybersecurity certifications, like the CISSP, CCSP, and the Security Plus exams, and I'm bringing that proven formula to you here with the CISA exam. As with all my exam prep courses, you'll find a PDF copy of this presentation available for you in the video description to leverage in your exam preparation as you require. You'll also find a clickable table of contents available in the video description, and it should appear automatically on your YouTube video timeline. Domain 2 is just a bit less than 1/5 of the exam at 18% by weight. And again, the exam consists of 5 domains, and with most of your ISACA exams, they divide each domain into a Part A and Part B. So in the series, we have 10 installments. We're currently in Domain 2, Part A. And 2A is divided into 7 parts. So we have laws, regulations, and industry standards, organizational structure, IT governance, and IT strategy, IT policies, standards, procedures, and practices. Part 4 is enterprise architecture and considerations. 5 is enterprise risk management. 6 focuses on privacy program and principles, and we'll wrap with data governance and classification. And of course our focus, as always, is from the auditor perspective, as we expect on the exam. So we'll begin with laws, regulations, and industry standards. So let's talk for a moment about the external environment, because IT governance has to operate within a framework of external rules based on our industry and geography. Some key focus areas here include data privacy and protection. So if we're in the healthcare industry, HIPAA regulations apply. If we have customers in the European Union, geography, GDPR regulations apply. We need to focus on intellectual property, the sensitive information that the company values for its strategic advantage in its industry. Reliability of financial information. If we're a publicly traded company, we're subject to Sarbanes-Oxley or SOX regulations. And compliance requirements can have that global reach because, for example, even if we are a US-based company, if we have customers located in the European Union, GDPR regulations still apply. So for the exam, know that you don't need to know the specifics of every law, but what you must understand is that these external requirements shape the control environment. So let's talk about the auditor's role in compliance. So not to be a legal expert, but to verify the process of compliance the customer has undergone or the auditee has undergone is in fact effective. So your audit checklist would include a few key questions like, does the enterprise identify all applicable laws? Is responsibility for compliance assigned to senior personnel? Do we have accountability attached to leadership as it should be? Is there a process for monitoring, auditing, and enforcing compliance? So for the exam, focus on the auditor's role in verifying the existence and effectiveness of a compliance framework within that auditee. So let's talk about GRC. It begins with governance, so managing policies, processes, and decisions. Risk, where we identify, assess, and treat potential risks. And compliance, adhering to laws, regulations, and standards. The goal here is an integrated, holistic view of assurance that enables an organization to reliably achieve objectives, address any uncertainty, and always to act with integrity. If I were to provide an analogy for GRC, governance is the steering of the ship. It is the guidance and oversight. Risk is looking for the icebergs in the sea, finding those potential risks, assessing them, and treating them. And compliance is following the rules of the sea, the laws and regulations in this case. So just a reminder of that term we just saw, assurance. And we talked about this in Domain 1. I want to give you a refresher because it's going to come up again today. But assurance is the level of confidence and trust that an organization's systems, processes, and controls are effective in protecting information assets, managing risks, and ensuring compliance with relevant standards and policies. The who, how, and what of an audit affects the level of confidence. So, for example, an external audit will provide a higher level of confidence than an internal audit to potential customers. And a SOC 2 Type 1 report that looks at a point in time will provide a lower level of assurance than would a SOC 2 Type 2 report that actually tests controls over a period of time. And we'll dig more into SOC reports later, but just a couple of examples for you there. So let's dig into Domain 2A2, Organization Structure, IT Governance, and Strategy. So Enterprise Governance of IT, EGIT for short. This is an integral part of corporate governance led by the Board of Directors and Executive Management. The core concerns here include value delivery, so answering the question, does IT support and enhance business goals? And just know that on ISACA exams like the CISA and the CISM, IT and security alignment with the business is front and center, very important. Risk management. Are IT-related risks identified and managed effectively? The primary driver here is strategic alignment of IT with business objectives. Again, always top of mind on ISACA exams. So if we separate the governance, the what, from the management, which is the how, governance evaluates stakeholder needs, management plans activities to meet those stakeholder needs. Governance sets direction for the enterprise, management builds those capabilities. Governance monitors performance and compliance, management runs and monitors day-to-day operations. And from a responsibility perspective, governance is driven from the board of directors, management from executive management. So governance sets the direction, management executes it. So let's talk about key governance committees. So we have the IT Strategy Committee and the IT Steering Committee. So the Strategy Committee is driven from the board level, meaning the board of directors. The Steering Committee driven from the management or executive management level. The role of the Strategy Committee is to advise the board on IT strategy, alignment, and big picture issues, whereby the IT Steering Committee then executes that strategy by approving project plans, budgets, and priorities. Your Strategy Committee is setting strategic direction, much as their name implies, and the IT Steering Committee is providing tactical implementation. So the IT Steering Committee's primary role is to ensure that IT projects support business requirements and deliver value to the business. It is the body that approves and oversees major IT projects. So remember that about the IT Steering Committee. Let's talk for a moment about the 3 lines model. This is a model to clarify roles and responsibilities for risk management. The first line is operational management, which owns and manages risks and controls as part of their day-to-day job. The second line, risk and compliance functions, which provides expertise, support, and monitoring over the first line, over operational management. And the third line is internal audit, which provides independent and objective assurance over the first two lines. So even internal auditors should have independence. They should be free from fear of reprisal or punishment if they report negative results in an audit. They must be independent and objective at all costs. Very important. And as information systems auditors, we operate in the third line. So let's talk separation of duties. So what is the purpose of the separation of duties? Important for the exam. It's a key control to prevent one person from having conflicting critical responsibilities and is aimed at reducing the risk of fraud or error. Fraud is where it most commonly comes up. The auditor's role here is to review the org chart to assess if separation of duties is properly implemented. And if separation of duties is not possible, which is a fact especially in small to medium businesses, we need to look for compensating controls. If we can't separate duties, we want to have some sort of supervisory review to make sure that duties are being carried out in a best practices and ethical and the desired fashion. Detailed audit trails so we can always determine who did what and when, so we can implement accountability, enforce accountability for one's actions. Reconciliation, reconciling the actions that took place to make sure they meet with best practices. And then exception reporting, when we have a problem, that is surfaced in a report somewhere. So just to connect some dots here, remember that a compensating control is an alternative security measure put in place when a required or primary control cannot be implemented. So, for example, with a small organization where I was implementing or responsible for some oversight of their security posture, we had a situation where one employee could not do their work without frequently activating an elevated privilege role, a high privilege role with considerable frequency and sometimes with several hours of active elevation time. So what we did was implemented a compensating control because he couldn't wait for approval specifically because his manager was frequently unavailable. So that would affect his work negatively and potentially affect operations. So since we couldn't implement an approval step every time he tried to elevate that role, what we did instead as a compensating control was implemented notification. So every time he activated that elevated privilege, everybody in his group would get an email that says, hey, Johnny implemented the global administrator role. So we had a backup there. He knew everybody was watching, and we know that oversight breeds good behavior. It directs behavior and compliance. So let's talk about number 3 on the list here, IT policies, standards, procedures, and practices. So you want to be familiar with the hierarchy of governance documents from an ISACA perspective. So we have policies, the high-level statements of management's intent. This is the why. Standards, these are the mandatory requirements to ensure compliance with policies. These establish the what we're aiming for. Procedures are the step-by-step instructions to achieve policy objectives. Procedures define the how we will get that done. And then guidelines are the recommended non-mandatory, and non-mandatory is the key phrase here, meaning optional, best practices. These are the how-to tips, but for the exam, make sure you know this hierarchy: policies, standards, procedures, and guidelines. In part 4, enterprise architecture and considerations. So it's important that you understand enterprise architecture from an auditor perspective. You don't need to be an enterprise architect, but the purpose of enterprise architecture is to provide a blueprint that defines an organization's structure, operations, and technology to achieve its current and future objectives. The primary advantage of an enterprise architecture is that it guides technology selection and ensures new initiatives align with the overall IT framework and business strategy. There are frameworks out there for enterprise architecture like Zachman and TOGAF that provide a structured way to view the enterprise. An information systems auditor should identify an enterprise architecture as incomplete if it lacks a future state description. Because at the end of the day, without knowing the destination, the roadmap is useless. We must understand what the desired future state is that we are working toward at all times. Number 5 on the list is enterprise risk management. We're going to break this down, and I'll actually reference a couple of topics from the CISM exam that will better support your understanding for the CISA. So enterprise risk management is a structured process to manage threats and reduce risk to an acceptable level. So it results in residual risk at a level that is acceptable to the business. Some important terms you need to be familiar with here. The risk appetite. This is the amount of risk the enterprise is willing to take to achieve its goals. It's a strategic decision set by senior leadership. And then there's risk tolerance. This is the acceptable deviation from that risk appetite. There may be situations where our risk tolerance varies from our overall risk appetite. This is really more of a tactical measure as we're planning and implementing new services and technologies. But the first step in the risk management lifecycle is asset identification, because at the end of the day, you can't protect what you don't know you have. So I want to step back and look at this terminology a bit more broadly from the CISM exam perspective. So we have risk appetite that I just mentioned, the amount of risk the organization is willing to take on across all assets. There is risk tolerance, which is the amount of risk the organization will accept for a specific threat or asset pair. So when we look at a specific system and the threat that faces it, if the level of risk is higher than the risk appetite, then we have a range of risk tolerance where we will accept some variance. And then there's another term you don't see come up directly in the CISA exam. That is risk capacity. This is the amount of risk the organization can absorb on the whole and still survive. So risk appetite sets the boundary for risk acceptance, and risk tolerance sets the boundary for our willingness to accept some variance there. So to phrase it another way, risk appetite is the willingness to take risk. Risk tolerance is the acceptable variation with a threat asset pair. And risk capacity is the maximum bearable risk. So let's talk about the 4 responses to risk. I already mentioned one of them, which is acceptance. So just to break these down, we have mitigate or mitigation, and risk mitigation is typically the most common response in an organization. We implement controls to reduce the risk. And from an auditor perspective, we verify the controls are implemented and tested, functioning as expected, to say it another way. Risk avoidance, we avoid risk. We stop the activity that is causing the risk. And from an auditor perspective, we verify that activity has been eliminated. And risk avoidance means that an organization may forego certain business opportunities because they deem the risk outweighs the potential reward. And then we have risk sharing or risk transfer, where we shift the risk in its total or in part to a third party. This is often done through an insurance policy or an outsourcing contract to an external firm that brings specific expertise. And then the 4th response to risk is acceptance. This is formally acknowledging the risk, documenting that risk, but doing nothing. We just accept the risk as it is, that it is acceptable at its current level. From an auditor perspective, we make sure that there is a documented management decision. And from an auditor's perspective, It is a red flag when management simply ignores a risk without documenting a formal acceptance. And we want that formal acceptance to also have a timeline. It needs to be revisited on a periodic basis. Typically, that is annually at the outermost boundary, in my experience. It can vary, but when we have that formal acceptance, we typically want some time limitation that brings us back to revisit to make sure that acceptance is still okay in the context of our risk appetite as an organization. So let's talk about risk analysis methods. There are 3 types of risk analysis you should know for the exam. The first is qualitative. It uses descriptive rankings like high, medium, and low. It's simple and it's the most common, but it is subjective. It requires the opinion of the smart person in the chair who presumably has some level of expertise, but they are not always an expert. And not everything requires exhaustive risk analysis, so that's why qualitative, especially for smaller risks, is very common. Then we have semi-quantitative risk. So this assigns a numeric scale to the qualitative rankings to add structure. So for example, high equals 5, medium equals 3, 1 equals low, and we can then add up multiple risks and based on a score decide where these risks collectively fall and if we accept them. And then for maximum precision, we can take a quantitative approach, which is a method that uses numeric, often monetary values to describe risk. And in fact, quantitative risk analysis generally seeks to assign a monetary value so we can ensure that the controls we implement are cost effective. It's more objective, but it can be complex. It does involve multiple risk analysis formulas that you'll tackle in other exams like the CISM. But generally speaking, we want that monetary value so we can determine that the control we have implemented is cost effective. I wouldn't want to implement a $10,000 control for a system that could be replaced for $5,000, for example. That wouldn't be cost effective. So I want to talk about risk analysis in the broader life cycle. So I've pulled over some information from the CISM exam. This will give you the context you need here because this life cycle does come up in the CISA. So there's IT risk identification and then risk assessment. And risk assessment speaks to the broader process of assessing all the risks we encounter. And then there is responding to that risk and mitigating or responding in the appropriate way. We talked about the 4 responses to risk. And then ongoing risk and control monitoring and reporting. So the 3 methods of risk analysis we talked about happen right here. So risk analysis happens at an individual risk level, identifying the appropriate responses for the risks we encountered at the higher level risk assessment. And then down here at risk response and mitigation, that's where we are implementing our response. That's what we call risk treatment. So we mitigate, or we avoid, or we transfer and share, or we accept, right? And then from a reporting and monitoring perspective, this is where we identify any changes in the environment. This is going to drive improvements. If we discover that a control is not operating as effectively as it once was, that's where we're going to recommend changes and improvements. And because risk is ongoing, the ISACA perspective is that risk management should be viewed as a continuous adaptive loop. Let's talk about number 6 on the list, privacy program and principles. So there's privacy notice and privacy policy, and you need to know the difference between the two. So the privacy notice is public. That is a notice for customers, advising them of our privacy expectations and how we are protecting their privacy, where the privacy policy is internal, it's for employees. And both of these are important, right? Our customers need to know how we are protecting their data. We need to inform them of their rights when it comes to data privacy at an appropriate level. And regulations like GDPR, for example, lay out very specific data privacy requirements that we must follow in order to avoid heavy fines. So the privacy impact assessment is a process you should be familiar with, at least in terms of its intent. It's a process to identify and reduce privacy risks. It's typically done before a new project starts. And then we need to be familiar with the legal basis for processing. So to process a customer's personal data, an organization must have a lawful reason to do so, such as consent from the individual themselves and a legitimate interest in doing so, such as fraud prevention, for example. If I have an e-commerce website and there's a pay flow there, I'm going to ask that customer for personal information, their name, their address, a credit card. I need that personal information not only to accept payment, but to make sure that the person holding that credit card is the rightful owner so I can prevent fraud, for example. So let's talk just a bit further on privacy program fundamentals. So the data subject rights. So I mentioned individuals have rights over their data. That's going to vary by geography and industry for sure. So they do have access to basically correct or delete their data. The rights will vary by industry and geography and the type of data we're dealing with, but that data subject, that customer in most cases, like in the GDPR context, they have the right not only to correct that data, but to tell us to forget them. And we have to be careful about trans-border data flow. There's a key risk area involving legal complexities of moving data between countries, because when it comes to personal data such as protected health information, there are going to be some restrictions about where that data can reside. And some countries have very strict regulations in that they will not let that data be stored outside of their country's borders. And this can be especially challenging in the public cloud, for example. And here I'm talking about SaaS applications or platforms like Microsoft Azure, Amazon's AWS, Google Cloud Platform, where data may be replicated to multiple sites, to multiple geographies for performance and availability. It's quite common, for example, that when you set up a storage account on a public cloud platform, that if you configure redundancy, you may be replicating that data to a backup site. And you just want to be careful that you're not replicating outside of a country border that leads to problems. So from a CISA exam perspective, you want to be aware of data subject rights and the major compliance challenge that is represented by trans-border data flow. Let's talk about data governance and classification. Number 7 on the list. So data governance is the overall strategy for managing data accuracy, integrity, and security. It treats data as a strategic asset. And we might not always think of data that way, but if you think about the asset that attackers are after, it is generally our sensitive, valuable data. And if we were to have a security breach that results in exfiltration of that data, leakage of that data, that has a high cost for an organization, right? It may cost that organization its reputation. It may forever reduce the level of trust customers have in that organization. So it's definitely a strategic asset. Data classification is categorizing data based on its sensitivity so we can apply appropriate protection. The benefit here is that when we identify our sensitive data, it allows for enhanced control with an optimum budget by focusing security on the most critical data. Typical levels, these are going to vary, but typical levels might include restricted data at the most sensitive level, confidential, internal data, so data accessible by all employees but not to the public, and then public data that would be openly accessible to everyone, like marketing slides, for example. So let's talk key roles in data classification. There are 2 in particular you want to be most familiar with for the exam. There is the data owner. This is typically a business manager or director. They are accountable for the data. That means that the ultimate responsibility and liability for that data rest with them. They cannot delegate accountability. They are responsible for classifying the data. and they define the access rules. They tell us what appropriate use looks like. And they will work with the data custodian. So the data custodian role is typically the IT department. They are responsible for the safe custody and storage of the data. They implement the security controls defined by the data owner. So IT and the security function serve the interest of the business. We're always trying to support business activity, not hinder it in any way. So the data owner is responsible for classification, and remember, the business owns the data, not IT. The data owner is that business manager or director, and they are accountable for that. So some key exam takeaways from Domain 2 Part A. Remember, the board of directors holds ultimate accountability for governance. Make sure you can distinguish governance, which sets direction, from management, which executes on that direction. Remember, the IT steering committee oversees and approves projects. Remember that hierarchy we looked at: policy, standard, procedure, and guideline. And remember, an enterprise architecture is incomplete without a future state. A roadmap doesn't make sense if we don't know the ultimate destination we intend to reach, that future state we are aiming for. Remember, risk management begins with asset identification. We cannot protect that which we are not aware that we have. Make sure you master the 3 lines model and the purpose of governance, risk, and compliance. And remember, the data owner, the business, classifies the data, and the data custodian, which is typically IT, protects that data. All right, my friends, that's what I have for you in Domain 2 Part A. I hope you're getting value from the series. As always, if you have questions, drop them in the comments. Reach out on LinkedIn. Happy to help anywhere I can. I'll be back to you with Domain 2 Part B in a couple of days. And until next time, take care and stay safe.